Context of White Supremacy, Gus T Renegade, and Justice, tuning in for another program of the C.O.W.S. Hopefully we will share constructive information on racism, what it is, and how it works, and hopefully we could even offer some suggestions to what to do to work against racism. We have a great guest for today. He authored a fantastic book. Before we get into that, I just want to make sure I remind everyone, please join the Facebook group, Back the Bus. Put lots of effort into that. There's a link right on the Blog Talk Radio page. Click on the link for the Facebook address. It'll take you right to the page. You can join. You can comment about the shows. If you have guests that you would like to have on the program, you can suggest there. Any of your views that you would like to express about the show, you can put it down there. Lots of good stuff there. So join the Facebook group, and please check out Back of the Bus, his webpage, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com. He has been very helpful for the program, foundation of the C.O.W.S, Back of the Bus. Thank you for your support, and check his website. Today's program, I have a great anecdote to kick this program off, and I'm ecstatic to ask our guest today his thoughts. A non-white person was disagreeing with my views on racism and saying that basically I was ignorant and didn't know what I was talking about, which could be true. And he said that, it's very foolish to reference yourself as a victim of racism. And he said that, Muhammad Ali, he never went around calling himself a victim. He went around saying, I'm the greatest, I'm the champ, I'll beat anybody. That's what I am, and he went out and did it. You don't make change going around saying you're a victim. That's not what Muhammad Ali did. And I had not read, today's guest, I had not read his book at the time that this individual made these comments. As I was reading the book that our guest for today's program wrote, wow, the comments that this non-white person said resonated. Oh my gosh, I'm really interested. I cannot wait to hear our guest's thoughts on those comments and someone making that sort of comparison between non-white people and how they deal with racism, how they talk about racism. Just very interesting. The book that we're going to be talking about today is titled Darwin's Athletes, How Sport Has Damaged Black America and Preserved the Myth of Race. Our guest today, he is from the University of Texas. If you've been listening to the C.O.W.S, you will know we've had two other guests from the University of Texas, Austin. One of them was Dr. Robert Jensen. Excellent program. He shared tons of great information. The second guest from the University of Texas was Dr. Martin Kevorkian. Outstanding book, outstanding program. The Longhorns have set a very high bar for what they've shared on the program, so he will have a big standard to live up to. Our guest for today's program, Dr. John Hoberman. Dr. Hoberman, are you with us?
I am. Good evening.
Outstanding. Good evening, sir. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us today.
My pleasure.
Please, sir, could you tell us anything that you think would be helpful so that our listeners get a better idea of who you are and the work that you do?
I am a white academic. I have done a lot of work in the area of sports, including race, politics, and drugs. The Darwin's Athletes book that came out at the beginning of 1997 got me very interested, even more interested in the situation that African Americans deal with in this society, and has led to another book that is almost done on medical racism. Readers of Darwin's Athletes know that the issue of medical racism is part of American history. When I went looking for the origins of racial stereotypes that were associated with black athleticism, I decided to read the medical literature, and what I found there shocked me. What I found there shocked my father, who was in fact a doctor. So I, these days, am spending almost all of my research and writing time dealing with racial issues. The great thing about studying sport is that it leads everywhere. It leads into race relations. It leads into all sorts of political questions. It leads you to medical issues. It leads you to all sorts of pharmacological issues, doping issues, as everybody knows by now. So this is the way I spend my time in the latter part of my academic career. Hello?
Oh, I'm sorry. You can hear me?
Now I can hear you.
Oh, okay. Just making sure. Yeah, Dr. Hoberman, when I contacted him, he sent me a report that he did on racism in the health industry. And in fact, he was so informed, I didn't even mention Professor Dorothy Roberts' name. I just said that a professor from Northwestern was on the program, was talking about her work with racism in health. And he said, oh, was that Dorothy Roberts? He did a great book on killing the black body. Yes, that was Dorothy Roberts. Very informed. Real treat to have Dr. Hoberman with us on the program today. You said that you are a white male. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. The name of this program is the C.O.W.S, Context of White Supremacy. I have, unfortunately, as I'm a non-white person, I have unfortunately concluded that we are in a global system of racism, white supremacy. The definition that I use for white supremacy is a global system of people who classify themselves as white and are dedicated to abusing and or subjugating everyone in the known universe whom they classify as not white. Do you believe that such a system exists, and do you think that definition is accurate?
I think that that definition is accurate up to a point, but too categorical, in the sense that I don't think that all of the people who are classified or who classify themselves as white harbor the kinds of dominating and exploitative intentions that you ascribe to them. I mean, I would call myself one of many, many white people who recognize that there is systematic oppression in lots of societies, including this one, that there is a tremendous imbalance of power between whites and blacks in the United States, in the European societies where there are relatively small numbers of people of color, but that as of today are living out the racial problems that the United States went through in the 1950s and the 1960s. What I do subscribe to is your implicit suggestion that there is a tremendous imbalance of power between people who are classified white and people who are classified black or as color in this world.
Okay. And I'm not fishing for agreement. There has not been one guest who's come on this program who we've had complete agreement on everything, and I never expect that to be the case when the discussion is racism. But I did want to clarify, I'm not saying that every white person is dedicated to abusing and mistreating non-white people, but what I am saying is that the system of white supremacy is driven by people who say that they are white and are dedicated to maintaining that imbalance of power between people who are white and people they say are not white. So do you think that that is true? You said you do believe there's a system of white supremacy. Is that correct?
Yes, in the sense, well, I think that it's composed of a couple of major phenomenon. One is the structural imbalance of power that has resulted from all sorts. I mean, let's just stick to the United States, which we know better than other societies. and which has a very large population, 35 million African Americans in a total population of about 300 million. That's lots and lots of people. Those of us, including yourself, of course, who have studied the history of racism, the history of race relations, the history of this imbalance of power, understand the restrictions under which black people have been living and have operated, have been forced to cope in the course of the past several hundred years of American history. And one of the results of this, as I am by now, after 15 or 20 years of work in this field, I'm well aware, is that it is all too understandable that enormous numbers of African Americans bear a mistrust towards whites. Most recently, I've been looking at this in the medical sector, and there is absolutely no question that African Americans have been doctor avoiding to a degree that whites on average are not, because of the history of medical racism that has produced a great deal of mistrust of the medical establishment. This is a tragedy, an American tragedy that does not get anything like the attention it deserves. Another way I know this is, I don't know if you're familiar with a very good book by a black anthropologist called Dry Longso. This is a book that came out, I think, in 1981.
Can you repeat that title for me, please?
Dry Longso, which, as spelled as it sounds, which is a term, I think it's an old African American term, the exact meaning of which I forget. But in any case, this is what John Langston Gwaltney, I believe, is the anthropologist who put this together. It is interviews with, 3 decades ago, 25 working-class African Americans whose lives had not been easy. It's a fascinating book. And one of the red threads that runs throughout every single one of these 25 interviews with people who had hard lives and who had thought about them was a distrust of whites. It's there everywhere. And one of the things that white people today have got to deal with, and by and large do not deal with, is the existence of this mistrust. And the fact that African Americans in their own ways lead really complicated lives as a consequence of having been forced into the predicament that they have been for hundreds of years now. So what you're hearing is the way that one white scholar has tried to make sense of American race relations in a series of studies that he's been working on for 15 or 20 years.
Outstanding. My co-host, she is a non-white female, and she is all of 10 years old. She does understand that we are in a system of racism, and she's trying to learn as much as possible so that she can assist in replacing that system with a system of justice where no one is mistreated and everyone gets the help that they need when they need it. She is Justice, and she also would like to ask questions as well. Justice, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Outstanding. Do you have some questions you would like to ask Dr. Hoberman?
Yes. Before I ask some questions, I would like everybody to speak at a low vocabulary level. Thank you. And my question is, how do you practice white supremacy?
How do I practice white supremacy?
Yes.
Not by intention. There are many of us who try, in fact, to do the opposite. If I am practicing white supremacy, I am probably unaware of what I am doing. And that is why it is important for me to hear from other people. For other people to hear me, to hear the results of my work and to respond in ways that are going to make me think and re-examine the way I have thought about racial matters and the way I conduct myself. One arena in which I have operated now for almost 20 years is the classroom at the university. And in that classroom, I have worked with dozens and dozens of African American students. And this has been one of the most interesting experiences of my lifetime, because I grew up back in the 1950s in segregated circumstances, at a time before African Americans were really free to express and assert themselves in ways that have become very important since the 1960s. And that means that when I was a kid, I was very poorly prepared to deal with race relations, with having real relationships with African Americans. This is something I had to learn as a grown-up. And working with black students and black professors was a kind of racial education for me. And I got lots of interesting feedback. For example, here's something I remember from the very first year I taught an African American Studies course. We had a review session, and this was a course called Race and Sport in African American Life. And I remember sitting in a room during a review session with 7 black students. They were all women. And so here is a white man on one side of the table and 7 young black women on the other side of the table. And one of the young women said to me, "Why are you doing this?" Which was a very interesting question. Why are you doing this? And the answer that I remember giving those students went as follows. First, because the race and sport, race relations, is an absolutely fascinating field of study. The second reason is because I think the work we do in this field can produce useful knowledge that can make our society better than it is. So that's how I would answer your question.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Do you have some more questions you would like to ask Justice?
Okay. What do you do when you are around white people who practice racism, white supremacy?
I don't spend time with white people who practice racism and white supremacy. I see some of them on television. I read about them in newspapers. I read about them in a lot of the documents and magazines and books I read to learn about the way race works in the United States. But if I were around someone who practiced racism, then it would be my obligation to correct that person, to straighten that person out, to challenge that person. I have one memory to offer you in this regard. I remember many years ago talking to a guy who, way back in the 60s, had been my friend. And years later, I met him. And one day, we were walking down the street in Massachusetts, and he said something that clearly, I think, a black student had passed by. He said something that showed his bitter disapproval of affirmative action. And the next time I had a conversation with him was on the telephone. And I told him that what he had said was so unacceptable to me, I could not continue our relationship in good faith. So that is one of the rare examples where I found myself in the company of a white person whose racial feelings were not acceptable to me.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I don't have any more questions.
Oh, okie dokie. I will come back, and hopefully you will have thought of some other great questions to ask Dr. Hoberman. I want to hop to the book because this is a great book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and hopefully some of our listeners will check it out to get some of the great information you have in Darwin's Athletes. But before we dig in, I read this book. I think I was maybe 100 pages into the book. And, one of the people that's listening in, I'll get to his question in 1 second. There's a chat room along with the show, and people are commenting about some of the responses. I'll get to that in 1 second. But I was reading your book, sir, and I got about 100 pages in, and I thought, oh, my gosh, I can't wait to hear what he's going to say about Jim Brown. And I kept going, and like, no Jim Brown. Maybe it's the last chapter. And so I checked the index, and no Jim Brown. And I said, my gosh, how did he construct this book on racism and sports? And it's predominantly focused around black male athletes with no mention of Jim Brown. And for the people who are listening who don't know who Jim Brown is, Jim Brown is widely regarded, no argument, as one of the best NFL players of all time. He is also regarded as, with no argument, one of the best lacrosse players of all time. That's something most people don't know, but he was a two-sport athlete at Syracuse where his jersey was retired. But more than that, Jim Brown spoke out about racism a lot. I don't even know if there are too many athletes I could even compare. Really, I don't know if there are too many black people I could compare to the amount of time he spent talking about racism and addressing problems that black people face. He even organized a group of black athletes during the prime of his career to try to work with black businesses. He involved Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He involved Wilt Chamberlain. He did a lot of, and still does work with his American program. He even, at Michael Jordan's prime, was publicly critical of Michael Jordan for not being more outspoken and dealing with issues that black people face. So how did Jim Brown not get in this book?
I think the answer is I didn't know as much about Jim Brown as you do.
Oh.
I mean, I'm old enough to remember Jim Brown, and I know that he has for a long time been an activist, and that this makes him unusual. I did not know about his collaboration with Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. I don't think I was aware of how early you describe his activism. It's very unusual for an active athlete, and this is anybody. I don't care whether you're talking about an African-American athlete or some skier from Norway or wherever. It is very unusual for elite athletes to be politically active, especially in their prime, because they are so vulnerable to the political machinations of the sports administrators and coaches and owners who do so much to control their lives. So I think the answer to your question is I didn't know enough to include him. You can't. I mean, one alibi is that you can't get everything and everybody into one book that's 300 pages long. But in this case, I didn't know enough.
Oh, okay. I was curious. I normally don't start with questioning something that an author did or did not do, but Jim Brown, as you said, since most athletes do not come out and take a strong political stance addressing something, Jim Brown stands out for a myriad of reasons. He has gotten in some trouble for doing incorrect things, but I mean, he is widely recognized for the work that he has done, talking explicitly about racism for at least at this point, 40 years, and he was doing this at his prime. He had a 2,000-yard rushing season. He won an NFL championship. His jersey's retired at Syracuse. He's in the NFL Hall of Fame, and he's just as well known for the work he's done talking about racism and being publicly critical of Michael Jordan at his prime.
Consider this. I've known for a long time that Jim Brown has been considered the greatest running back of all time. In other words, I knew about his greatness as an athlete. I knew less about his political activism. And that tells you not just that there are gaps in my knowledge, but that there are tremendous gaps in the way sports is covered by the press, by the media in the United States. Most of the sports pages, to me, are a wasteland, because all you're getting is scores. All you're getting is play-by-play. All you're getting is sports gossip. What I'm looking for is the kind of stuff that you're interested in talking about on your program. That side of Jim Brown, I will wager, has been very poorly covered compared with his achievements as an athlete. And I'm glad you brought up his criticism of Michael Jordan. I believe this was 1992, and there was a very fine candidate named Harvey Gantt running against Jesse Helms, of all people, in the North Carolina Senate race. And incredibly, Michael Jordan, then at the peak of his career, actually refused, who'd gone to North Carolina, actually refused to endorse a fine black candidate against a racist like Jesse Helms. And at that point, I think we all understood that Michael Jordan was owned by his corporate sponsor. His advisors, his lawyers must have said, "Don't you dare."
Would it be accurate, because I'm very much about being as clear as possible, that's one thing I think we can all do to work against racism, white supremacy. Would it be correct that to say that Michael Jordan, a non-white male, subject to the powerful white people who most likely practice racism, white supremacy?
Well, he was definitely subjected to the influence of powerful white people who were controlling this super famous black man. The interesting question that comes up in a case like this is, how do we want to assess the responsibility of the individual? To what extent can you say that, as a matter of fact, you are obviously a well-informed man with strong opinions. To what extent do you fault Michael Jordan for his failure to do what many people would have considered his obligation as an African-American citizen?
Unfortunately, as I said at the beginning of this program, and as I say at the beginning of every program, we are in a system of white supremacy, unless I have concluded incorrectly, which could be true. The people who are most to blame for anything on this planet as it relates to people would be the white people who practice white supremacy. They are most to blame for whatever Michael Jordan did or did not do with regards to supporting this non-white candidate or speaking out against Jesse Helms or all the other things Mr. Jordan has been criticized for. Michael Jordan, just like myself, is a victim of white supremacy. He is not the most powerful person in Chicago, North Carolina, or anywhere on the planet. So we could all sit around and say Michael Jordan should have done more, and maybe he should have. But I do understand, hey, he, like me, is a victim of white supremacy. White people tell me what to do. White people tell him what to do. White people tell all non-white people what to do worldwide, unless I'm incorrect. And if I am, please let me know.
Well, here is how I would approach what you just said. You take, in effect, a forgiving, understanding, exculpating approach to Michael Jordan. And of course, at that point, he was a rather young man, and I think it's extremely important to remember that. But by the same token, there are lots of non-white people who are told to do things by various whites and who refuse to take orders, who refuse to do what is expected of them by white people who benefit from the imbalance of power, who are defiant, sometimes to the point of real heroism. You know, a man like John Lewis, for example. So my question would be: are you sure you want to classify everybody in one category as opposed to making some distinctions?
As a non-white person, and again, I want to let all of the people who are listening to this program know, I could be incorrect. So think about what I'm saying. If you don't agree, no problem. I could be wrong. My view is that in a system of white supremacy, the non-white people all have the same status. I do not feel that it serves my interest as a victim of white supremacy to say, well, this non-white person I'm going to put on this level, and this other non-white person I'm going to say he's at a lower level because he's not doing this, he's not doing that. I certainly acknowledge if a non-white person, be it John Lewis, be it Jim Brown, be it even Michael Jordan, anybody, if they're doing something that I think is constructive to work against racism, white supremacy, I will point that out, and I might see if I can do some of what they're doing. But I don't think it's constructive to get into saying, well, I think this non-white person, what they're doing is great, so I'm going to put them on this level, and the people who are not doing that or people who are doing things that I don't think are constructive, I'm going to put them on a lower level. I think the most important thing is to remember all non-white people have to answer to white people at the end of the day. That's the most important distinction that I make if I'm going to talk about one person being above this person for what they do or what they don't do. That distinction is going to come down to, is this a white person? Is this a non-white person? As long as we're in the system of white supremacy.
Well, that is, from my perspective, a very categorical approach to the balance or imbalance of power between whites and blacks.
Hold on one second, because wait a minute, one sec. I don't mean to interrupt you. I don't understand what you mean when you say a categorical approach. I would, before you respond, number one, we need to make sure that we have some understanding. We are both talking within the context of white supremacy. Is that correct? A system where white people worldwide dominate non-white people. Is that correct?
That is certainly true in the United States. Yeah.
Well, I said worldwide, white people dominate non-white people. Is that correct?
If we look at the post-colonial world, you're probably right about that as well.
Okay, so we are operating within the context of white supremacy worldwide. Please continue.
Right.
And we want to make sure that, I want to make sure just when you give responses, Justice is here and she is 10. If you could give responses using a vocabulary level so that as many people as possible can understand what you're saying, that would be very helpful. If you could just bring the vocabulary level down a little bit lower. Thank you.
Sure. Well, again, I am, some of your statements make me want to ask you questions, as you know, and in this case, when I said categorically, I mean that it seems to put everyone in exactly the same situation You're not making distinctions between the situations of some people and others. While accepting your claim that there is a terrible imbalance of power between black people and white people, I accept that as a fact. It's an historical fact. Then the question becomes, what can people do? And in this case, it's what can non-white people do in order to have better lives and in order to push back against the imbalance of power and in order to make themselves more free. I don't hear you talking about that.
I want to make sure I'm understanding you correctly. You said the way that I am speaking about the system of white supremacy and non-white people and how they respond to the system of white supremacy seems as though I am not making distinctions between different non-white people who might be doing different things, might have different privileges, might have access to different resources. I'm not making a distinction. I am looking at all of the non-white people within that system in the same manner. Is that correctly summarizing what you just said?
Yes.
Okay. The reason I am doing that is because under the system of white supremacy, if you are non-white, you basically are on the same level. And white people who practice white supremacy prove that every day, whether they are talking about President Obama as if he is a child, whether they're talking about Michael Jordan as if he is a child, whether you in your book, when you talk about how Muhammad Ali was neutered, quote unquote, using your word, in putting him in an insect pest control commercial later in his career to show that he was no longer the loudmouth black athlete complaining that he would not go and fight the non-white people in Vietnam who had never mistreated him because he was a nigger. White people prove every day, if you are non-white, you come under my thumb. Whatever you have, white people give you, whether it's Michael Jordan, white people allowed him to be a star. Not that long ago, white people would not have even allowed him to come in the gym, much less make millions and millions of dollars playing basketball and selling shoes. That needs to be acknowledged as long as we're in the system of white supremacy. That's the reason that I'm speaking the way that I am, and that's the reason that I do not criticize any non-white person as long as we're in the system of white supremacy. The people who are most to blame for everything that happens on this planet as it relates to people are the most powerful white people who practice white supremacy. I would have gripes to them about Mr. Jesse Helms running and winning or anything else he's doing or anything that I don't think should be happening, that's happening incorrectly on this planet. My gripes would go to white people, not Michael Jordan.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've made your position very clear.
Okay, and are you saying anything that I have said is inaccurate or is anything incorrect about what I said?
I think it's a question of perspective. I mean, it's the angle at which you approach the imbalance of racial power that we continue to talk about. I guess I do not agree with your refusal to make certain kinds of judgments about the way non-white people conduct themselves or do not conduct themselves. I would prefer a position that says that to one degree or another, people are responsible for what they do. There are often combinations of motives and there are circumstances that can compel people to do certain things or to refuse to do certain things, like stand up to Jesse Helms or whatever it happens to be. I would prefer to acknowledge the fact of the racial imbalance of power and then talk about people's different situations within that framework.
Okay. I want to see if Justice has more questions, but before I ask her, I would like to request the phrase that you're using, racial imbalance of power. I think it would be more accurate, and it would be most helpful if we're working to establish justice, if we could use terms that are most accurate. If we could not say racial imbalance of power, if we could just say system of white supremacy, because we've agreed that exists, and that's what we're talking about, I would appreciate that. Justice, do you have questions that you would like to ask Dr. Hoberman?
Yes.
Kiddo, go right and speak up real loud so we can hear you, please.
Okay.
Good job.
Why is everywhere I go, I hear and see white people in every media? Why is that? Why not show many non-white people on those things?
You mean like television, for example?
I mean on magazines, television,
right.
movies, everywhere.
Right. I think the answer is that there are many more white people in our country than black people. That is one answer. Another answer is that the people who make the magazines, the people who put the ads together, assume that the products that they are advertising on the pages of a magazine or in a television ad are going to make more money for them if they are talking mainly to white people. There is advertising that is aimed at non-white people in some cases, because one terrible example of that is cigarettes, is menthol cigarettes, where you have ads where you see black people, because the tobacco companies want black people to buy certain kinds of cigarettes that they know non-white people have been buying for a long time. So I think that the reason you're seeing more white faces than non-white faces is that the people who sell the magazines and who make the advertisements think that they're going to make more money that way.
Okay. Who teaches you how to practice racism and white supremacy?
Who teaches, excuse me, once again, please?
Who teaches you how to practice racism and white supremacy?
I would not say that there is anyone right now who is teaching me how to practice racism and white supremacy. When I was a child, it was the society around me that taught me all sorts of things that were racist, that made me think about non-white people in certain bad ways. And I think that part of the system that our host keeps referring to is our habits, the kinds of habits we develop thinking about different people. and the way we are taught to think about different people. In my case, my parents taught me, my parents were liberal white parents back in the 50s. And what they taught me was to respect non-white people. That does not mean that I grew up to be a perfect boy who always respected non-white people. It means that in a very racist time in our society's history, they were trying to do better.
Yes.
Do you have some more questions you would like to ask Justice?
No, not right now.
Okie dokie. I will come back. Justice is a co-host here. I am co-host. She is a co-host. I did want to point out, because I've noted you said my claim earlier, and you just said that the system our host keeps referring to. I want to be very clear. We have agreement that we are in a system of white supremacy, so it doesn't need to be our host keeps the system our host keeps referring to. It can just be the fact that we have agreed on. We are, all of us, in a system of white supremacy. This is not something that I'm making up, I don't think. And at minimum, we both, at least you and I, Dr. Hoberman, agree that we are in a system that is predicated on the domination worldwide of white people over non-white people. My question I wanted to ask, one of the central themes in your book that I really appreciate, it really goes back to the comment the non-white person made about me in comparing me to Muhammad Ali, and saying that Muhammad Ali didn't run around saying he was a victim. He said he was the greatest. He said he could beat anyone, and he went out and he did it. That's how you make accomplishments. One of the great things you point out in your book is that the accomplishments of non-white athletes, your book specifically focusing on black athletes and especially black male athletes, their accomplishments tend to be exaggerated as though they represent some sort of conquest over the system of racism, white supremacy. You point out this is not only white people but non-white people engage in this. You use examples of Jackie Robinson, Michael Jordan, Joe Louis, Jack Johnson. Could you share with our listeners why you feel that's something that really we need to pay attention to?
Well, I'm thinking back to a story in the book from the year 1895. And this is a time when the term the Great White Host was coined by a newspaper man in New York. And by the 1890s, there are black prize fighters who are beating white prize fighters. And for some white men, this is a real problem. This is a challenge they find very unpleasant, and they want to do something about it. And what I remember from 1895 is an American psychologist who publishes an article that says, sure, black men, black prize fighters have begun to beat white prize fighters, but don't worry about it, because this is not really important. Muscle is not important. Physical, athletic ability at the end of the day is not what is important. What is important is brains and being smart. And of course, in 1895, everybody knows what whites thought about non-white people's intellectual ability. This, I think, is a very important story because it makes your point at a rather early stage in the history of modern sport, and that is the black man can beat the living daylights out of the white man, But the question is, at the end of the day, what does it really mean? What does it really mean for the stature of that individual non-white prizefighter? What does it mean really about the lives of the great non-white population from which this man came? And as you suggest, for a long time now, it has been very, very tempting for whites and for non-whites to take black athletic accomplishments and exaggerate their significance, and to use these victories as a kind of substitute for more important victories that non-white people have needed for a long time. So that this habit of magnifying the importance of black athletic accomplishments has served both populations. It has served the non-white population by filling lots of people with a sense of pride in what these black athletes accomplished. It has served the white population in another way, by giving whites a reason to feel good about black-white relations, to give whites an opportunity to say to themselves, well, of course non-white people have opportunity in this society. Just look at what that prize fighter did. Just look at what this basketball team did. Just look at what this running back did. So I agree that this is a very important point that has influenced the thinking of non-white people and white people alike.
I don't want to take too much credit here, because I hadn't really thought too much about this particular issue until I read your book. So it's not so much my suggestion. This is directly in your book, and something I appreciated getting from reading your book. But I'm feeling pretty, I'm Samuel Cartwright. You quote him in your book. Actually, several guests that now have been on the program have talked about Mr. Cartwright's work from the 19th century, and I believe I'm suffering from a little bit of rascality. I'm going to take exactly what you just said to really drive home why I do not think it's correct to criticize Michael Jordan or any other non-white person. If you really understand the fact that we're in a system dominated by white people, predicated on white supremacy, you would realize Michael Jordan, white people allow him to do that. That in no way is compromising the system of white supremacy. If it was, he wouldn't be there. Michael Jordan is not incompatible with the system of white supremacy.
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. Yeah.
Okay. So and I just want to finish hammering that home. White people who practice racism, as you talked about in your book, they can enjoy and did enjoy the Harlem Globetrotters, Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, Michael Jordan, now I'm sure LeBron James, Tiger Woods, or any other non-white athlete, and still go back and practice racism, and some of them have said as much. So as long as that's the case, there's really no reason for me to attack any non-white person, particularly Michael Jordan or any other black athlete, because, hey, I understand at the end of the day, they're a victim just like me, which you talk about in your book.
May I ask you a question?
Please, go ahead, sir.
Where so you do not want to contrast, for example, Jim Brown with Michael Jordan in this way?
You mean, I just want to make sure I'm understanding your question. You mean I don't want to pick out the fact that Jim Brown has done a lot of things to work against racism, explicitly to work against racism, whereas Michael Jordan, at least to my knowledge, has not done a lot of things to explicitly work against racism. Is that
I think that is exactly the point, yeah.
Okay. As I said before, I do, obviously, if I know about what Jim Brown has done, even you said maybe even a little more than you do, I do think it's important to know if people are doing things to work against racism and to know if they have constructive results or if they don't exactly bring about what you would like to happen for non-white people to replace white supremacy with justice. However, that doesn't mean that I look at Jim Brown and I say, oh, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, I'm going to put him at a 9, and I'm going to look at Michael Jordan and say, oh, I'm going to put him at a 3. I don't really think he's done that much. They're both victims of white supremacy. I can appreciate what Jim Brown has done, but at the end of the day, we're all on the bottom of the boat, particularly with regards to white people. I know the white people who practice racism, white supremacy. I know Jim Brown is a nigger. Michael Jordan is a nigger. And they've even come out and said that about President Obama. That's how the white people who practice racism, white supremacy, see non-white people. They don't make distinctions to say, well, these non-white people, I think they're cool. These non-white people, I don't think they're that cool. If you're not white, you're someone I can mistreat. You are someone I dominate. So I'm going to look at this the same way. Non-white people, we're all on the same level, even though I can acknowledge, and I definitely want to be aware if non-white people are doing things to work against white supremacy. Hey, no problem there at all. But that doesn't mean that you get an elevated status above the other victims.
May I ask you another question?
Sure.
Do you think the oppressive system that we both agree exists will ever come to an end?
Say that one more time. I'm sorry.
Do you think the racist system that you and I both agree exists, do you think it is ever going to come to an end?
Oh, for sure. We wouldn't be having this show right now. I've said repeatedly, if I didn't think white supremacy could be replaced with a system of justice, I would be smoking crack. I would be trying my best to get a white woman who had money. I would not read your book. I wouldn't want to hear anything you had to say about racism or anyone else. I would not listen to anything having to do with racism. I didn't care what the person was talking about. I would just be trying to do as best as I could to insulate myself from the mistreatment. And as I said, I'd be doing drugs, and I'd try and get a white woman who had some money. That's what I'd be doing. Yes, I for sure think this system is going to end at some point, and I hope we can make it as soon as possible. It's already been here too long.
Well, I'm very glad to hear your response.
For sure. Justice, have you thought of some questions or anything else you would like to say before we move forward?
Yes. Who do you know that practices racism, white supremacy better than you?
Better than me? Did you say practices white supremacy better than me?
Yes.
Do you think that I'm practicing white supremacy, Justice?
Well, do you practice white supremacy?
I don't think so.
How do you not think so?
Because I have thought about this for a long time, and I have thought a lot about my own behavior, and I have spent a lot of time with non-white people talking about what we're talking about on this show.
Okay, then if you're on the show, then I thought you were supposed to be talking about white supremacy.
Well, we're talking about white supremacy, but that's not the same thing as my doing it. That was the point I wanted to make.
Then do you still want to answer that question? Because I would really like an answer to that.
Well, the answer to the question is that no, I do not know anyone like that.
Okay. And then, how do you function around non-white people?
I think I function pretty much the way I function around anybody.
What functioning is that?
Listening to what people have to say, respecting them, trying to help them as a teacher, trying to learn from them, whoever they are. That's the way I would answer your question.
Okay. And how do you work to produce justice?
Well, that's I like that question.
Hang on, I'm not done with the question yet. How do you work to produce justice if you're not a white supremacist?
If I'm not I didn't hear the last thing you said.
If you're not a racist.
How do I work to produce justice if I'm not a racist?
Yes.
Well, I work as a teacher, and I write books that try to explain the relations between white people and non-white people in the sports world, in the medical world, in the teaching world. So I'm interested in all of that stuff, and I hope that the work I do produces justice.
Okay.
Do you have more questions you would like to ask, Justice?
No.
Okay, we'll check back in a minute or two. I have a question. I want to address some of the comments that you talked about, specific things that David Stern, he's the commissioner of the NBA. I suspect he's a white person. I also suspect he is a racist white supremacist. But before I get to that, I did want to ask, Dr. Hoberman, do you think it would be possible for a white person to write books about racism, to listen to non-white people talk about racism, to do radio programs that address racism, white supremacy? Do you think it would be possible for a white person to do all of those things and still practice racism, white supremacy?
I think so.
Okay, I think so.
It depends on how much that white person knows about himself or herself, and his or her sincerity.
Okay. I just want to reiterate, I think it's possible for a white person to do all of those things and still practice racism, white supremacy. You talk in your book, seems like you're an NBA fan. I used to be as well.
No, I'm not an NBA fan.
Really? You have a lot of information about the NBA in particular in your book.
That's because I do research.
I have great respect for research, for sure. Your book is thoroughly researched. You talked about David Stern, as I said, for those who do not follow basketball. David Stern, white person, he is the commissioner of the NBA. If you watch the finals, David Stern is the white guy, I think he's a white guy, with glasses, who's giving out the NBA trophy at the end of the year. That's him. That's David Stern.
He's definitely a white guy.
Yeah, okay, there you go.
He's a lawyer. He's a lawyer, and he's probably making about $10 million a year.
Okay, there you go. Another white person said he's a white person, so I have to take his word for it. He quotes Mr. David Stern. I just thought this was unbelievable. I've also heard some quotes that David Stern has made that I thought were pretty revealing, and it just revealed a lot about racism, white supremacy. But in your book, on page 34, you were talking about a comparison that was being made between the way that Disney markets itself and the way that the NBA is marketed, particularly since the NBA has predominantly black players being marketed to a white audience. And you quoted David Stern, and he was talking about this comparison between Disney characters and a predominantly black league. And he said that, well, you know, Disney World, they have theme parks, and we have theme parks, only we call them arenas. They have characters, Mickey and Goofy. Our characters are named Magic and Michael Jordan. Disney sells apparel, we sell apparel. They make home videos, we make home videos. I looked at that and I just thought, my gosh, you talk in your book about the dehumanization of black athletes. Can you talk about that, particularly in the context of that sort of statement that is comparing black athletes to cartoon characters?
Absolutely. No, David Stern, I mean, how could I possibly be an NBA fan and have written Darwin's Athletes? I can't, because it is too clear, and I get the sense that you see this the same way I do, that there's a real sense in which the NBA is a minstrel show. And it is a form of entertainment that has lots of racist potential. It's racial theater. It is a theater in which the control of predominantly black men, whether you're talking about the NBA or Division I basketball, where this, I mean, talk about a system of white supremacy. Until quite recently, the idea of making African American men coaches, for example, what was very, very rare. I guess Bill Russell was the first. That was years ago. When you look at Division I football, you're looking at about 120 colleges, universities. There is a tiny handful of black men, in this case, who have been allowed to become head coaches. In the NFL, the situation is not that much different. And so what I argue in the book, as you clearly saw, is that the NBA, in a way, is a certain kind of a racket. It's a way of providing entertainment that preserves what I keep calling the imbalance of power between blacks and whites, as long as black men and women are identified primarily with what their bodies can do as opposed to what their minds can do. This is going to continue to support the white supremacist system that you rightly criticize. So in that sense, integrated sport is racial theater, is what I call it in the book. And you can argue that this has good effects in that it could possibly make white people identify with, perhaps feel more familiar, more comfortable with black people. That is one argument one often hears. The celebration of Jackie Robinson and his great breakthrough into Major League Baseball in 1947 is celebrated as a major event in American social history. You point out, I would point out, that there is a great temptation to exaggerate the effects of this particular event in the history of American race relations. And in the NBA, as you clearly saw, this is particularly naked. And David Stern, the commissioner, is naive enough to make the public comment that you read to our audience. He is clearly clueless about how other people how a lot of other people are going to hear what he has to say and interpret what he has to say. I agree with you. It's a remarkable statement that tells you a lot about who is running the NBA and why they run it the way they do.
Excuse me. Again, this is Dr. John Hoberman, professor at the University of Texas, Austin. I was a rabid NBA fan. NBA basketball was my heroine. I don't think I could convey accurately the obsession that I had with NBA basketball when I was younger. I can just tell you all, I memorized every game the Chicago Bulls lost for the 1991-92 season. I could tell you every team they lost to that year. They were 67-15, so they didn't lose to that many teams, but I could tell you every game they lost, and I think I watched probably every one of their playoff games that year. Just a ridiculous obsession with NBA basketball, which you talk about in your book, Black People's Obsession with Athletics, and how that has not been advantageous to them being able to work against racism, white supremacy. The thing that eroded my connection to the NBA was when I became more aware of racism and I started to understand when David Stern would make comments like that and understanding them within the context of white supremacy. I wanted to ask, because your book, you pointed out it came out in early 1997. Did you said you don't watch NBA basketball, but did you pay attention to the debacle that happened when the brawl in Detroit? The players got into a big fight in Detroit. A fan threw a beer in a player's face. A black. Okay. Did you? Okay. Could you?
Oh, sure. That was a few years ago.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Right.
Can you point out if you saw any racial dynamics play out that happened in that whole big brawl?
Well, I cannot run that tape in my head with a lot of detail at this point. I think so. Let me make a kind of more general point, and that is that there are situations, and this, of course, was a televised situation, and not only was it a televised situation, this was a brawl that got tremendous coverage, as you recall. That there are that when you give tremendous publicity to certain kind of sports events that are going to feature mostly African American athletes, and we're talking about African American male athletes, then anything that happens that is disorderly, anything that happens that is violent, anything that happens that provides a forum for misbehavior is going to, most of the time, reflect badly on those non-white players.
That incident, that was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me, that I officially stopped watching NBA basketball because of the coverage of that particular incident. It was just very blatant. They portrayed Ron Artest as a King Kong figure, standing, hovering over this, just small, timid white guy, about to pounce on him, just total savage, just every ugly stereotype of black male athletes that you could think of. They just threw it on Ron Artest for that incident. That completely severed my connection, cured me completely, and I don't really follow anymore. I did want to point out, because you talk in your book about the psychological damage that white people have experienced as a result of no longer being the dominant athlete. You even pointed out the Rocky films that you felt were an attempt to kind of shore this up and show a white person succeeding athletically. And particularly in the Rocky films, he's frequently, his opponent in those films is frequently a black male.
Sure.
I feel those films, and they just did another one now, there's 6 of them, those films incredible amount of racism, white supremacy in those films. I mean, it's astounding. In the last film, his black opponent is named, and this is no joke. If you check the last Rocky film, the black opponent is named Mason the Line Dixon. That's his name. That's his name in the film. But this is not about racism at all. Could you share with our listeners just, some of what you talked about in your book with regards to Rocky and how that plays out in terms of supporting, the battered psyche of white athletes?
Well, this is a very interesting topic, and I'm glad you brought it up. There's a couple, I think, major things to point out here. First of all, the white racial superiority complex of the late 19th century really did hold white men out as athletically as well as intellectually superior to black people. And so, as you point out, over that period of time, from the 1890s and then up into the 20th century, there are a lot of white males in particular, and I guess some white females, who had to adjust to the rise of the black athlete and who had to concede pride of place to very tenacious, very talented, accomplished black athletes who were doing things that black people were not supposed to do in a Jim Crow society. And one of my favorite themes is what I call coping strategies. I hope that's the term I used in the book. That whites, in order to deal with the rise of what became known as black dominance in the 1970s, for example. That, I believe, is when you have black men finally and very clearly dominating in the NBA. The numbers are going way up in the National Football League. And the term used in the 70s and for some time afterwards was black dominance. And it's clear that a lot of whites are going to have to find ways of coping with the fact that if they're sports fans, they are going to have to consume a lot of sports entertainment that is going to feature people who don't look like them, who do not have white skins. And looking at the way white people have made these kinds of adjustments has been very interesting to me. And I'll tell you, I think in a way, the most fascinating example here is Tiger Woods. I would love to hear what you have to say about Tiger Woods, because Tiger Woods appears to have become accepted in a way that the great majority of very successful black athletes have not been. Of course, there have been racist incidents associated with the career of Tiger Woods. There was the stupid joke in the golf magazine about the noose a couple of years ago. There are white sports commentators in any sport that is televised who simply cannot help making self-revealing remarks that demonstrate their own inability to accept the presence and the success of lots of good black athletes. So, in this sense, you can look at white behavior as a kind of sign or indication of how whites in general may be doing in terms of accepting the fact that African Americans are their fellow citizens, that African Americans do work hard and make sacrifices and are patriotic, etc. The one point in the book is that you can use the sports world to try to keep track of how large numbers of people are thinking about race. And of course, this applies to non-white people as well as white. I mean, do you want to give us your thoughts on the extraordinary figure who is Tiger Woods?
You asking me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. I mean, I clearly feel, number one, he is a victim of white supremacy, as you pointed out. Many incidents of either things being said. I had actually forgotten all about the whole noose incident where I believe it was a white woman said that joked that they should take him out and lynch him. Yep. Fuzzy Zeller's comments about the fried chicken.
That's right.
I do find it very interesting that white people generally reference him as a black person.
Yep.
He has made a big to-do about saying he is, I believe it was Cablinasian, pointing out that, you know, he has a parent, I believe his mom, who's so-called Asian. He's made a big to-do about, you know, saying, hey, I'm multiracial, I'm da-da-da-da, and for white people, that just doesn't seem to matter at all. He is just regarded as a black person. I find that very interesting. But at the end of the day, and the fact that he's married to a white woman, for me, for a lot of other reasons, that's something I study a lot. Him being married to a white person is very interesting to me. But more than anything, I view him as a victim. I would agree that he is not regarded in the same way as Mike Tyson was when Mike Tyson was at the height of his career, or Jack Johnson when he was at the height of his career. Certainly he seems to be treated better by many white people than those two athletes, or many other athletes, even currently. Maybe even I would say he's even treated a little better than Michael Jordan. I even think that might be plausible. But I just see an overwhelming amount of evidence that, more than anything, he is a victim of white supremacy. With all of the fame and money and success that he has, there's still country clubs that won't even accept him as a member.
Is that really true?
Yes. This has been...
I didn't know that.
Yes, sir. In, I believe, the area of the world known as Georgia, the state Georgia, there's a country club there that's close to the Masters that he has applied to 3 times and been denied all 3 times. And ESPN has even talked about this. The country club has said that they have denied him because they don't want someone of his stature. He'll bring a lot of media attention, and they don't want all that at their club. White people even published a list of some of the white people who are members of this club, and they have tons of rich and famous white people who are just as media worthy of attention as Tiger Woods. And they were saying this seems like it could be racism, the fact that you're not letting him in the club. So that's why I would say, more than anything, he is a victim of white supremacy above and beyond. I want to double-check. Justice, do you have some questions that you would like to ask Dr. Hoberman?
Yes.
Go right ahead.
You did say that you are not a racist, right? Yes or no?
Right.
Okay. Then that means you are a victim of white supremacy, right? Or no?
That's a very hard question.
Okay. Do you think you can please tell me at least 2 white people you know that practice racism, white supremacy?
I cannot think of any white people I know who practice racism or white supremacy.
Are you around a lot of white people?
I certainly am.
Then you should know at least 2 white people who practice white supremacy, right?
I don't think so, and I would also say that there's a great deal about the many white people I'm around that I don't know. I mean, there's lots of things I don't know about the way they talk when they're not around me, about the way they behave when I'm not there to watch them.
Okay. How do you think you would feel once the system of racism, white supremacy is eliminated?
I think I would feel very happy and relieved.
Okay, thank you. I'm done for right now.
Okay.
Okey-dokey. I'll come back and see if you have some more questions. I'm going to see if we can get some callers in because folks have called in. I'm sure they want to ask questions. Hopefully, some of them may have even read your book. So, yeah, we'll get to them in a second. If folks would like to call in, the number to ring the line is 347-215-6071, University of Texas, Austin, Dr. John Hoberman, our guest this evening. Dr. Hoberman, before I get to the calls, I did want to point out two things, then we'll go to the phone lines. In your book on page 204, you talked about how the public life and times of non-white person known as Mike Tyson had done a lot to hurt the cause of black people. Could you, I guess, expound on why you think that is and if you think that's accurate to say that in the system of white supremacy?
I think Mike Tyson is arguably the most demonized black athlete in American history.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, I'm looking at a page on my computer now that is an advertisement for a Mike Tyson fight. I believe it was back in the 1980s, and this is an ad. I think it came out of the Dallas Times-Herald newspaper around 1985. And what this ad says, with displaying the kind of snarling face of Mike Tyson, is Mike Tyson challenges his slave contract. I'm not kidding. It says, what? Slave contract. Yeah. This is the 1980s, not the 1880s. Here is the general point that I would make about Mike Tyson and, by extension, a lot of other black athletes. When black athletes, and of course, especially black male athletes, get into trouble, this is racial theater. And this is a perfect opportunity for a lot of people, and especially white people, to say, I told you so, I knew it, I was right all along. Black people are naturally violent, they are naturally criminal, they are natural misbehaviors. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at a series of slides that I use in a slideshow for students and other audiences that is all about the demonization and the racist use of black men who are athletes. Here is a picture of, I can't blow this thing up, so I can't identify who this man is, but it's a famous NBA player, and he's got lots of tattoos on him, and he's stripped to the waist the way black men often are in American media, in a way that white men are not. This is a cover of Sports Illustrated from a number of years ago, and the title is Bad Boy. The use of black male athletic faces in advertising in the United States almost always emphasizes hostility, emotional retentiveness, the looks of frustration and resentment. I think I talk about some examples of that in the first part of Darwin's Athletes.
Yes, sir.
What you see is the systematic use of black male athletes for the purpose of stereotyping and caricaturing them. This can be used by advertisers to sell products. It can be used by editorial people, presumably white editorial people, who are just unrestrained in their use of these kinds of images. And all I'm saying is that Mike Tyson may be the outstanding example of the black athlete who has been demonized for public consumption, so that in the 1980s it was perfectly possible for a major newspaper in Texas to publish an ad for a Mike Tyson fight that referred to this fight as his attempt to break out of his slave contract, unquote.
Wow. When I was promoting this program, I attached the Vogue cover that had LeBron James with the white female. Did you see that cover? It came out last year.
I sure did.
Okay. I think that is a beautiful illustration of exactly what you just talked about and talk about in your book of white people, presumably, racists, presumably, using black athletes to fit stereotypes of black people being demons, predators of some sorts. That photo looked strikingly similar to a King Kong poster that came out in the 1930s, where she even had on a dress that was the same color as the white female in the King Kong poster.
No, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. As a matter of fact, as soon as that cover hit the stands, I got a call from an African-American journalist who wanted to talk about this, and that is, I offered her the same conclusion that you offered our audience, that this was an obvious use of the King Kong motif. The big, physically powerful black man, or in the film, of course, it's an ape, and the symbolic blonde figure. I mean, not only did King Kong come out, I believe, in 1933, it was remade not that many years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see this LeBron James, Gisela Bündchen, or whoever it was, this blonde. It had to be a blonde, right? It had to be a blonde supermodel.
She's actually Tom Brady's wife, or significant other, the quarterback for the Patriots.
Well, I mean, I just cringe when I see King Kong imagery, and I think I remember reading that the people who put that cover together, of course, when they were asked about it, as they inevitably were asked about it, disclaimed any knowledge of, this being a racialized image or a racist image or a King Kong look-alike or anything. Now, it's possible that they were so ignorant that they didn't understand what they were doing. Whether they did or they didn't, there were a lot of people out there who understood what was happening with that image. And it's a 19th century way to think about black people in the 21st century. There's lots and lots of 19th century mental habits with regard to thinking about racial difference that have survived in one form or another into the 21st century. And that is one of the underpinnings of the system to which you refer, and it is a sign that we have a long way to go.
For sure. I'm going to go to the phone lines. I did want to point out, excuse me, I did want to point out for our listeners, unless I'm incorrect, I did do some research on that photo. The photographer who did the LeBron James shoot, her name is Annie Leibovitz. She has done a lot of photographs that, in my view, are just blatantly racist, white supremacist. I posted some of them online. One that I can point people out that I think most people saw, it's a collection of photographs with generally a white person and a non-white person talking about Africa. One of them has George Bush with Desmond Tutu. I think Oprah Winfrey's in another. It's like a collector's set for Vanity Fair. I believe Bono and Jay-Z and George Clooney, and there's a whole lot of famous people. The same person who did the shoot for LeBron James with him doing the whole King Kong thing, also did that photo shoot. So you can check that out. Her name is Annie Lebowitz. Going to the phone line, see if folks have some questions they would like to ask Dr. Hoberman. 253. Do you have questions you would like to ask Dr. Hoberman?
Yes, sir. Can I be heard?
Yes, sir. We can hear you.
Dr. Hoberman, what benefit is it to a white person to make a distinction between the level at which victims of racism are working to replace white supremacy with justice?
To encourage more activism as opposed to less activism, to achieve the end of getting rid of a racist system.
Do you feel as if a racist system such as the system of racism, white supremacy, could be eliminated if white people stop practicing racism, white supremacy?
Well, I think that would be the definition of the end of the system.
Okay.
Yeah, you can't argue with that.
Do you feel as if it would require non-white people to do something to have white people to stop practicing white supremacy?
Yes, I do, and I think that the civil rights movement is an example of that. That whites need to be pushed. One of the most important aspects of racism in the modern period, in my opinion, is white indifference. That surveys show that a large majority of whites are not interested in making contact with African American problems. They are not interested in thinking about or doing something about what I keep calling the racial imbalance of power. It's not a very compassionate attitude. And in that situation, I think it's good for everybody that non-white people, call them activists or people of conscience or teachers, whoever can make a difference, push back against white indifference or misbehaviors. I think that does make a difference, and I think the results of the great civil rights movement that occupied the 1960s is a good example of that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
That's all the question that I had right now. Only one comment would be is that we're still in a system of white supremacy. We're no longer in a period of so-called, I guess, civil rights. Still in the same system. That's all I have for now.
Thank you for your comment.
I will check, see if he has some more. 301, you are live with Dr. Hoberman.
Hello, Gus. How you doing?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. How are you doing, sir?
Appreciate it. Good.
Did I want to ask, because this caller, he specifically wanted me to do a show on sports and racism. So have you found this interesting and or constructive, Mr. Hill?
Very interesting and constructive.
Okay. Go right ahead, sir.
Well, actually, I'm going to ask about a player you probably know. He played at Texas, the quarterback Vince Young.
Yes.
Yes. And the question I have, a couple of years came out, he went to the NFL draft. NFL combine. And, they have this thing called the Wonderlic score.
Yep.
He scored a very low score. Now, I've heard that they do Wonderlic scores, but he was the only quarterback out of the whole bunch to get his score leaked. And I wanted to ask you a question. When I think of the NFL Combine, I think of it as a slave auction. Hello?
I think that is an excellent point, and in a minute I'll tell you why.
Because me and my friends joke about it. I said, you know who the indentured servants, and you know who are the slaves. And some of the comments of some of these so-called experts, as you would call a football, they would say, well, he's a heavy, he doesn't bend at the waist naturally. He doesn't have natural hands. And I couldn't understand, well, to order to catch a football, if that's not a natural thing to do, you have to practice those things.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the comments and things that they were saying on the tape on the program was like real out there. Me and I have a friend of mine, we were trainers, and we train kids to play football, and we were just listening to some of these racial things about players. Like you automatically know if a guy wasn't athletic, because the first thing they would say, well, he's tough and gritty and smart, and this kid is highly athletic. And they would use the things like, well, he's very lazy, and you know that they're talking about a black player. It's always the guy who doesn't have the athletic ability. He's always tough and smart, and the other guy is always highly athletic. So the reason I'm asking this question, Vince Young went to the combine. Now, I was talking to somebody on the way here. I was trying to get home to catch the program, and I was saying that black quarterbacks get treated differently than white quarterbacks. And the person I was talking to was someone white. And they said, well, I don't see it. I don't understand why. That if you're a quarterback, it's criticism across the board. And I said, no, it's not. I mean, I was trying to explain to this person. He said, well, I was trying to make the point, or not to make the point, but explain where I was coming from as far as they're not treated equally. And I said the position of the quarterback is still they still want white men to dominate that particular position in football. I would like to know your comments or answers to my questions that I asked.
I think that you're basically right. Before I forget, I want to tell you this little story from a class I was teaching, I don't know, 5 or 10 years ago. There was, as a matter of fact, I think it was about race and medicine. There were lots of African American as well as white students in that class, and the topic of sports came up. And a black woman in the class suddenly got upset about something. And what she was upset about was something that her boyfriend had told her. Her boyfriend was a very good African-American linesman playing in the line somewhere on the University of Texas football team, and I believe he wound up with an NFL contract somewhere. Why was she angry? I mean, here was a young man who was a friend of hers, whom he might even have been a fiancé. He was obviously headed for a big money contract. But what she could not stand was what he had told her about the NFL Combine. He had come back from the Combine feeling that he had been treated like a piece of meat. I'm not sure that he used the slave analogy that you did, but I have heard the slave analogy used by another former University of Texas African-American player who had clearly thought about this. He thought hard about it, and he had reached the dramatic conclusion that playing college ball in Division I was a certain kind of slavery. It was the image that he used. I don't think it's an accident that Vince Young's Wonderlic score was released. Like you, I cannot remember any sort of similar incident involving a white quarterback. Vince Young, of course, is a tremendously talented player. He was the answer here at the University of Texas for several years. They didn't have a chance without him, frankly.
Yeah.
They just didn't. Now, getting to your larger point about the way a lot of white sports commentators make racial distinctions in the words and the terms that they use. There's a long history of this. And those of us who have made a point of paying attention to the racial dimension of the sports world will recall a number of incidents like this. Maybe the most famous one was when the late Howard Cosell, a famous sportscaster years ago, referred to his great embarrassment to a black receiver who just made a great catch is a little monkey. Look at that little monkey, or what a little monkey, or something like that.
Matter of fact, I remember that game. That game, it was the Washington Redskins. Matter of fact, it was Art Monk.
Okay, well, you've got a better memory than I do. But the point is that even Howard Cosell, who was a friend, a supporter, a very early and perhaps even a brave supporter of Muhammad Ali back in the very early days in the 1960s, was capable of having that sort of racist folklore inside of his head. And in an unguarded moment, there it was, and to his great embarrassment, it went out to 10 or 20 million people. These mental habits, what I like to call racial folklore, is still with us, and it is going to show up in the sports world as both you and I recognize. We've heard examples of it, and it is one more sign that there is a lot of race education to be done and habits to be changed. Thank you for your call.
301, I want you to hang tight because I know you have another question you want to ask. Some other folks called in as well, so hang tight. I'll get to see if I can get another question in. I can't see the area code, so if you called in at 111 and you press the one to put your hand up, you're on the air.
Hotep victims.
Greetings, 720. How are you doing, sir?
Intensely victimized.
I know the feeling.
Yes. I did have a question for you, victim. Does May Ju Louis have a website?
She is a member. The name of the organization that she is a member of is called the Insight Community for Economic Development. They have a website, and if you go to their website, she has a page on that particular website. So if you go to my page and you look at the last show that she was on, you will see a link on that page for the Insight web page, and you can click that, and once you're there, you can get access to her particular page, and I believe even her email address is there. So all you should have to do is look at the last show and click on the link for the Insight Community Center.
Thank you. And I have a question for Dr. Hoberman. I came in late on the show, so if I'm asking something that you've already spoke on, I hope you can bear with me. Dr. Hoberman, on a scale from 1 to 10, if you were to rate 10 being the best and 1 being the worst, how much would you rate yourself in terms of trying to eliminate white supremacy and replace it with justice?
You're trying to quantify something that is really not quantifiable. But in order to try to respond to your question, I guess I'd put myself in the 6 to 8 range.
So would you say it has a high priority?
Given the work to which I am devoting almost all of my time these days, I would say that working on race problems is a high priority for me.
I see.
As well as the teaching that I do, yes. I am not claiming to be pure. I am not claiming to be a virtuous example. All I claim to be is a professional person who works on this stuff and is hoping to accomplish something.
I'm curious. The reason I ask is I notice that whenever white people really want to get something done, it gets done quickly. And I noticed that with Obama's health quick care plan and the number of white people coming out that are resistant to it and objecting to it. They're getting things done rather quickly and in great numbers, massive town hall meetings. And I was just curious with you saying you devote almost all of your time, and I think you said to Justice that you don't have any friends or white people that you know who are racist or who practice white supremacy. And it just seems curious to me with you devoting so much time that none of those white people who aren't racist and who don't practice white supremacy aren't coming out with that kind of activism, as you said, or being pushed in that way, since you devote so much time to do something quickly as they do with objecting to President Obama's health care plan. And so I was just curious, what's up with that?
Well, I don't think I am in a position to accomplish things on a social scale quickly. I think that the kind of work I do does not work quickly, but rather works rather slowly. I am not an executive. I'm not a politician. I'm not the chairman of a congressional committee who, as you point out, may well be in a position to do things quickly as opposed to being a foot dragger. I think the fact that we are talking about this evening about a book, we're still talking this evening about a book that came out almost 13 years ago, is an example of, well, working slowly. That part of my job is to make people think, and to make, in this case, to make people think about racial issues in a way that does not allow them to fool themselves, and in a way that confronts them with some of the harsh realities that Gus has been putting before us over and over again, and with good reason. So I'm not in a position to achieve quick results unless it's in the classroom and I can give encouragement or confidence or knowledge to a student who can quickly change. A teacher can do things like that quickly, whereas when you write books, you're going to, in most cases, you're going to be waiting to see.
Dr. Hoberman, are you still with us?
Yep.
Oh, okay. 720, if you had another question, just hang tight. There's got a lot of folks that called in. I guess they want to ask Dr. Hoberman questions.
Okay.
Person, I also cannot see your area code. If you also called in and you have a question for Dr. Hoberman, you're on the air. Please go ahead and ask. Again, I cannot see, can't see your area code, but if you called in and you have not asked a question, you're on the air. Please go ahead and ask your question.
I hope that's not me.
Oh, are you just listening?
Yeah, I'm just listening.
Oh, okay. No problem. No problem. Justice, do you have some questions you would like to ask Dr. Hoberman?
Yes.
Go right ahead.
Have you thought about that question about if you were a victim of white supremacy? Because I would really like a question of that.
I guess I am a victim in the sense that I live in a society in which racial justice is very often hard to find. And I guess I do think that white people are, in a way, victims of white racism when they are living with people who are not getting justice and who do not have the kind of opportunities that so many white people do. So yes, in that sense, I'm a victim too.
Okay, then are you a victim of white supremacy?
Well, I think they're the same thing. And so the answer, once again, would be yes.
Okay. And how are you a victim of white supremacy?
I think I would be a happier person if non-white people were as well off as white people are.
So you're saying that you are like a non-white person?
No, I'm saying that I am a certain kind of a victim. I'm like a non-white person in that everyone would be better off if there were no racism. Yeah.
So if the system of white supremacy was eliminated, would you still be a victim?
Not if racism goes away.
Sorry, can you say that again?
Not if racism goes away.
Okay. Gus?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you think he is a victim of white supremacy?
No, I do not think any white person can be a victim of white supremacy, and quite a few white people have come on this program and said the same thing and explained why that is the case. So no, I do not think he's a victim of white supremacy.
Okay.
Actually, Molly Secor, she came on the program and she said that a white person who says they are a victim of white supremacy is practicing racism, white supremacy. But she could be incorrect, but she did say that.
I don't agree with that.
Right on.
How do you not agree with that? And why do you not agree with that?
I don't agree with it because I think it's true that white people would be better off in a world without racism. Whether you want to call white people in a racist society victims or not, I think there's room for different words to describe that situation. And I certainly don't think that anybody who says what I said is practicing racism. I think that that is incorrect.
Again, I do not think white people can be victims of white supremacy. As the admitted white supremacist known as Tim Wise said, white people are not the targets of the system of racism. Therefore, he would not find it to be most accurate to reference them as victims. I wholeheartedly agree, and I do suspect any white person who says they are a victim of white supremacy probably is practicing racism. 951, are you there? 951, are you there? Do you have a question or comment?
Yes, greetings, Gus and Justice.
Oh, greetings, back of the bus.
Racism.
Hello.
Dr. Hoberman.
Yes.
You said earlier in the program that you practice racism, white supremacy unconsciously. Is that correct?
No, I did not.
Hello?
Yes, we're here. Back to the bus. Are you still with us?
My phone is cutting in and out. I don't know if you can hear me.
I can hear you crystal clear.
Oh, I got you. I heard crystal clear. Dr. Hoberman, did you hear my question?
Yes, I did, and I responded to your question by saying that I don't agree with you.
He said he did not say that he unconsciously practices racism, white supremacy. He said he did not say that earlier in the broadcast.
Oh, okay. I got you. You were asked the question, how do you practice racism, white supremacy? Can you refresh my memory how you answered that question?
How do you want to define that practice?
Sorry for the inconvenience, Gus and Justice. My phone is cutting in and out quite a bit. I'm going to hang up, and you both are doing an excellent job. Replace white supremacy with justice. I'm not sure if you can hear this right now, but
we can hear you. We can hear you crystal clear back of the bus. If you hang up now, you most likely will not be able to call back in because of technical difficulties beyond my control. So if you would like to ask questions, I would encourage you to stay on because we can hear you. We can hear you crystal clear. But, you know, if you can't hear us, then, you know. Oh, okay. Well, he left.
Okay. Gus?
Yes, sir.
We are past the 2-hour mark at this point, and we had agreed on a 2-hour interview. So can we do another question? And it's past 10 o'clock where I am right now.
Oh, yeah. Totally. Completely. I respect you hanging out with us, and I don't want to take up your time here. We'll get one last question in. 301. If you have a last question that you'd like to ask Dr. Hoberman, we can wrap things up.
My question is about black quarterbacks in the NFL. Why is it so difficult for black quarterbacks to actually be successful in the NFL? The scrutiny of the media and the white fans that go to the stadium.
In my book, I explained the situation of the black quarterback and the prejudice against the black quarterback in the following way. In that chapter of the book, I talk about the history of military racism and how one of the racist principles of this society has been that black men are not capable of leadership. There is, of course, a history of racism in the military, although we do have an integrated military at this point. President Truman finally integrated the armed forces in the summer of 1948, a few years after the end of the Second World War, in which many, many black men were not allowed to go into combat, believe it or not, because whites did not want them to earn first-class citizenship through demonstrating valor in combat. So my theory is that skepticism, racist doubts about the courage and leadership capacity of black men is an American tradition, and that the quarterback, who is traditionally referred to as the field general, term you may be familiar with, that prejudice against black men in this particular leadership role continues the tradition of military racism. As I referred to racist doubts about the leadership capacity of this group of people. The quarterback, as everybody knows, is supposed to be a leader, is supposed to be smart, is supposed to be a leader of men, is supposed to be able to memorize 400 or 500 plays, is supposed to be able to control situations, which means giving instructions, of course, to white teammates. So that's the historical context in which I would put the predicament of the black quarterback.
Before you go, I have one more question. I don't understand this whole thing about being in the pocket or quarterbacks having too much athleticism. Like some people, like Michael Vick, Vince Young, Donovan McNabb, all these quarterbacks are scrutinized because they have too much athleticism and they don't stay in the pocket and be the pocket passer, like the Peyton Mannings, the Tom Brady's, the Drew Breeses, the Jay Cutlers, those type of people.
Exactly. Well, I am not a great football expert, but I do know that the white quarterback has not been famous as a scrambler. The white quarterback has not been very distinctive as a double threat athlete who is a running threat as well as a passing threat. Staying in the pocket, doing those pinpoint passes was over time kind of coded as a white athletic talent, as white athletic behavior. So what happens? The door opens to black quarterbacks. Apparently, I don't remember the name of the man who was the very first black quarterback in the NFL, but I know that this was an extremely emotionally stressful experience for him, to the point that it really concerned people. I remember the University of Texas had a black quarterback in the early 80s. This is a football team that integrated in 1970, by the way. The Vince Young was extraordinary, but the old-time football types were simply not used to an athlete who, in addition to being a fine passer, was endowed with so-called natural athletic ability that allowed him to run and to present that double threat to the defense. So that's how I would respond to your question.
Okay, you said pinpoint accuracy. You said that's a code for white people. I mean, you said white athletics being accurate and. Hello? Well,
the quarterback position, as you pointed out, I think, was associated primarily with passing, with staying in the pocket and making good passes.
Right.
Now, what good black quarterbacks have demonstrated is that there's more you can do,
right.
That you can present that double threat. And so I would guess that the kind of behaviors that you're talking about result from old-timers or people in the football world who are having to learn to cope with a new model for the quarterback, who has got the running talent as well as the passing talent.
Okay, thank you for answering my question.
Thank you for your question.
Thank you. I want to thank Dr. John Hoberman. It's a 2-hour time difference from West Coast to Central, so it's a little later there than it is here. Thank you for staying with us a few extra minutes. Our listeners were really looking forward to having you on the show to ask you about your book, and I appreciate you sharing your time with us this evening, sir.
Well, thank you for a very interesting 2 hours.
Enjoyed it, learned a lot. Again, his book, Darwin's Athletes, How Sport Has Damaged Black America and Preserved the Myth of Race. I learned a lot from it. Check it out. It's in the libraries, bookstores, all that good stuff. Dr. John Hoberman, University of Texas, Austin. Thank you for being with us this evening, sir.
Thank you very much for your comments.
No problem. No problem. I'm going to make sure I play Mr. Edward Williams' commercial, and we'll wrap things up. I'll let people know about the shows coming up at the end of the week for a commercial break, and we'll be right back. And Justice can tell you all her email address. You can contact her as well. So quick commercial. We'll be right back.
Is racism hurting you? On issues of race, are you unable to speak, think, and act with clarity and confidence? Are you tired of laughing when nothing is funny, smiling when you are not happy, agreeing when you really disagree? At counterracism.com, you can learn specific strategies and techniques to counter the behaviors of the people who practice racism in all areas of activity. Using words correctly, following counter-racist logic, even counter-racist science projects designed to reveal what racism is, how it works, and how to counter it. The open source code writing format allows you to pick and choose from a variety of counter-racist suggestions so you can produce the code that works for you. Stop by counterracism.com today and help replace racism with justice.
That's counter-racism.com.
Context of White Supremacy, Gus T Renegade, and Justice. Justice, what did you think of the program and what Dr. Hoberman had to share with us?
It was, had a lot of information, and I do agree that he is not a victim of racism.
For sure. For sure. I didn't have any, I was not confused about that at all. I don't even think twice when white people say they're victims of racism. I just think this person is probably practicing racism and trying to confuse me. I suspect this person is most likely a white supremacist, and that's about it. Did you think he had anything constructive to share with us?
Yes. I'll tell you, yes.
Okay. I thought he had some constructive things as well. His book is pretty constructive. I've been very clear about my stance about purchasing the books of white people on the show, so you already know I'm going to tell you to go to the library if you're a non-white person. But I did think his book was pretty interesting. This book is not written to be easily consumed. This is one of those books. I suspect he wrote this for white people who've been to college. This is not one of those books that's easy to read. So if you can get through it, dictionary in hand, I needed a dictionary as well. It does have constructive information in it. You will learn quite a little bit. He talks about Joe Louis. He talks about Muhammad Ali, Michael Jordan, Michael Eric Dyson, white people who've been blatantly racist. He talks about the bell curve. Very, very informative book, I think. But yeah, at any rate, Justice, please make sure if you want to share. Do you want to share your email address so people can contact you today?
Yes.
Okay.
My email is justice.asap@yahoo.com.
Outstanding. Justice.asap@yahoo.com. That's where you can hit Justice at. Send her an email. Let her know how she's doing on the program. Feel free to email her. 301-720, you are with us. If you all would like to share your thoughts on the program before we close out, I know 301, you had been asking for the Sports and Racism show. There you go. You can let us know if you thought it was constructive, and 720, you're also on the air. So if you all have comments you'd like to share before we close out, go right ahead.
Well, I'll go first. I mean, since I'm a person who plays sports and tried out professionally, I thought the show was great as far as the information. He gave great, given the understanding of how white people use black people in this type of entertainment when they do something wrong, as minstrel theater. He said minstrel theater, right?
Yes, sir.
So I learned a lot. I thought that he was one of the most honest persons that really talked about sports, because in the sports world or anything like that, race doesn't, come in. It's all about an equal playing field. It's all about, being on an equal playing field and, being everybody can be. If you work hard, you can get places, you know. But I did enjoy the program. I probably will be listening to it tomorrow.
Right on.
So.
Appreciate it. 720, are you there? Do you have comments you'd like to share about the program, which you thought Dr. Hoberman shared with us?
Indeed, victims. Hi, Justice.
Hello.
I did have a question about sports for him, but unfortunately time didn't allow. I was very interested in hearing the questions that 301 asked Dr. Hoberman. Victim, I have a question for you because ultimately I'm always zeroed in on the bottom line, and that is if white people are really going to do anything about getting rid of this. And as I said to Dr. Hoberman, I do notice that they do get things done quickly when they want to. I do notice that. But victim, with all the white guests that you had on your program, like I say, I get the sense that ultimately, when it comes down to it, they're not really going to do anything, particularly with Jessica Pettit and all her yak about what she wanted to do, and then ultimately what she showed herself to be, demonstrated herself to really be when she said, good luck with your Amtrak ticket. Also, with I think C.O.W.S, and ultimately she could find nothing to criticize. I don't even remember his name. It's
Noel Ignatieff.
Yeah.
Yes, and also with the other guest, some other guests, it seems ultimately, or who was it? The other white person who admitted himself to be a white supremacist that was married to a Latina woman.
John Delport.
Yes, and ultimately it was all this yak about fighting this, but he saw nothing wrong with being with her. So it's just, like I say, my sense is that ultimately nothing's changing. So I wondered what your thoughts were in terms of your white guest and how much they are really going to do about getting rid of this.
I believe it was Michael Bradley. He was on the program in May, and he said that white people are going to practice racism, white supremacy, or die trying to maintain it. I agree wholeheartedly. I never thought that white people were going to work against racism, white supremacy. When I got focused on studying racism and being very precise with my words and really paying attention to things that white people do, white people were not happy with me. White people who said they were against racism were not happy and looking to support my efforts and to work with me in doing something constructive. They got angry, they got hostile, and they mistreated me. So I have never really felt that white people are going to stop doing this. I think there are a lot of motivating reasons as to why they are going to continue doing this unless non-white people force them to stop practicing white supremacy. But yeah, really that is why I bring white guests on the program. I'd much rather have a white person speaking honestly about racism, white supremacy, if they're willing to do so, because I have found that is more, non-white people are more receptive to white people. And also, I love the opportunity of demonstrating the Jessica Pettits and Tim Wises and the other white people who say they're against racism, and then their behavior on this program ultimately betrays them. I think that is very constructive, and non-white people have even written and told me that they thought it was crazy, me saying be suspicious of all white people, that they just couldn't do that. They didn't believe that, there was any constructive purpose to doing that. They have written me and said They listened to the second program when Jessica Pettit was on the cows, and that completely changed their opinion in hearing how she behaved, particularly with having Justice on that program and the way that she was cursing, she was rude, just her entire conduct totally changed their opinion about being suspicious of all white people. So that is really one of my main reasons for bringing white people on the show, so that you all get a first-hand to evaluate for yourself. If you really think these white people who say they are against racism, when it comes down to the come down, are they really about that, or is this just a lot of talk? And you can evaluate for yourself. Listen, see what you think. I've already made up my mind, but, whatever. I could be wrong.
I have a comment. The whole Jessica Pettit thing, I found it very interesting when she first came on the show. It was almost like a love fest with you. I want to meet you so much, Gus. The new people. I just want to meet new people. Now, the next time she came on the show was totally different. Hello?
Yes, sir.
And that was the most funniest thing in the world. I mean, I just can't wait to see you at the conference. I just can't wait. This is just going to be interesting. I can't wait for you to go. To actually see you, and really, because a lot of people have great, I call it a phone bravery when they talk on the phone, and then they have all this stuff to say. I wonder when she's going to say all this stuff while you're there. Hello?
Yes, sir. I can hear you.
So I just want to see exactly what would happen.
I think the major difference, I think one of the major reasons that the behavior changed was new co-host. I think Justice's presence had a great deal to do with her conduct. Now, I don't know everything in terms of why that may have had such a big impact on her, but I think Justice being on that program had a huge difference on her behavior. I don't know if it was because she wasn't expecting Justice to be here. A lot of people have written and said that they felt she was interested in some sort of sexual relationship with me, and perhaps Justice being here disrupted that. That could be. I don't know, but I think Justice being here played a huge part in the change in her conduct. And really, I don't think that should have been the case. I mean, Justice is all of 10 years old, and she's a non-white person, a victim of white supremacy. What's the big deal? She's just here to learn. Go ahead, Justice.
Oh, and I was going to say that I have noticed that since I have been on the show, more non-white people have been experienced in trying to eliminate white supremacy and get to justice.
I agree. I think a lot of non-white people have said they have learned a lot from you being on the program and appreciate your presence, as do I. I'm very happy you are co-hosting and looking forward to us doing more constructive work together, and hopefully we'll get better at replacing white supremacy, we'll get better in our attempts to replace white supremacy with justice. Non-Mighty Wick, if you're there, do you have a final thought before we wrap this sucker up here?
Nope, I sure don't. Not at this time. Thank you, sir.
Oh, no problem. We're going to get ready to wrap things up. I don't know who's on the East Coast. I suspect Mr. Hill is. Got to be late on that end, pushing 11:30. Definitely, I think this could have been a constructive program. I learned some things. Justice said she thought she learned some things.
Gus, can you hear me?
Yes, Cree, how are you doing?
Oh, very cool. I'm doing as well as can be expected. Listen, I just wanted to give out basically kudos. I have noticed that both you and Justice have just really, really gotten so much better at pinpointing. Is that the word that was used on this show? Being really, really precision with your questions. I just really enjoy the whole show, and it's just so difficult to believe that Justice is 10 years old with the questions that she bombshelled him with. Like, are you a victim? You know, if you're not a white supremacist, so what is it that you're doing to replace white supremacy with justice? If you're not a victim, are you a non-white person? It was just amazing. And I wanted to just, obviously I'm amazed at her, but I think that, you know,
Thank you.
So much credit. You're welcome, Justice. I enjoy you so much. I've learned so much from you. And I think that the decision to allow, you know, artist development is really, really important. I saw the little kids on the National Book Fair Festival on C-SPAN, and just being allowed to develop at a very early age and, you know, make the mistakes that everyone makes, but even at an early age, is really, really important. And I can see the dividends because she has just blossomed so amazingly. But I also wanted to give kudos to 720 and wanted to know the result, because I remember how I thought it was really courageous. I was kind of curled up in a little ball when he was asking John Delport if John Delport would contribute to your attending the White Privilege conference. And I wanted to know if Mr. Delport made good on his commitment that James asked him for.
I have been in contact with Mr. Delport since that program. Mostly we've been talking about, I had intended, I've been very busy. We've been doing a lot of shows, and there are like tons of shows coming down the pike. We'll be back on Thursday, we'll be back Thursday, Sunday, Monday, next Thursday, Saturday, and twice next Sunday. So I've been very busy. Woo. And, yeah, very, very busy. At any rate, I have been in touch with Mr. Delport, and the main thing we've been talking about is he Googled his name. I did think he's reminding me. I wanted to say this. Collateral damage from this program is all of the guests who've been on this show. If you Google their name, quite a few of them, this show will be one of the top things that pops up. I didn't expect that. That was not planned, but that is so. I have Googled Dr. Eddie Moore Jr.'s name, and this show was the third thing on the list. I Googled Dr. Martin Kevorkian's name. This show was the first thing on the list. So he Googled his name, and this was the first thing on the list, and the description said, admitted white supremacist John Delport. He flipped out. He emailed me and was like, you have got to take that down. Oh my God, that's gonna cause problems. I pray that you will change it. I'm going to put it on the Facebook page, so join the Facebook group. But he was very concerned about that. If you've checked, I did not change it. I told him, I even spoke with another suspected racist, and this white person said, you should not change it. If he admitted on the show to being a white supremacist, then what is the problem? Unless he's willing to come on the show and explain why it should be changed and what it should be changed to, no, it should stay the same. And Mr. Delport, I guess he talked to some other people, thought about it, and he conceded that, you know, he's willing to have it stay the way it is. But that is collateral damage from the program. If you Google these people's names, this show will pop up first. If you want to help the cows, Google some of the people who've been on the show. Just put their name in. If you see the show, click the link that will move the show up so that hopefully down the road, perhaps if you Google Tim Wise's name, this show will pop up on the first page. I think that's beautiful. That was totally unintended. That's just white people's technology pulling the cows through so that other people can find it that way. But, yeah, he did say he would be willing to hook me up with transportation to get to the White Privilege Conference. He said he'd be willing to do it. It's not until April, so he has a lot of time to change his mind or whatever, but we have talked about that, and he said he'd be willing to do it. So I should have transportation to get there, and I'm looking forward to going and acting a fool. They have not seen Gus live and in person. I can really act a fool in person because I don't have to worry about the white person hanging up the phone, so I plan on having a blast at the White Privilege Conference.
Okay, that was extremely informative. So, listen, I know everybody's staying up late, and you guys have so much work to do. But keep doing what you're doing. You obviously plan to with all those shows. So,
Lady Cree, thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
have one other question. Did Dr. Hoberman say anything about why in 1895 white people were so upset about the black prize fighters beating the white prize fighters?
In his book, yes, he does talk about that. I think he did say something about that on the program. I could be incorrect. But yes, in his book, yes, he does. And what he says is that this whole, the black super athlete, black dominant athlete, that is new. That during slavery, that was not the way black people were seen. They were seen as being deficient in all areas, mentally, physically deficient. That white people were seen as superior in every way, mentally, athletically. The white person was seen as just superior in every way possible. And that this changed after slavery, that this perception started to change, and that's why you saw so much animosity when Jack Johnson, when he won, and even in the 1936 Olympics, when Jesse Owens won, you saw so much animosity about this because that attitude of white people still being even superior in athletics was still hanging on. That is more of a recent change in how black people are perceived as being super physical specimens, although dumb. So, yeah, in his book he goes into quite a bit of detail in showing why those attitudes were there and the change in how black people were seen in his book.
And can I ask one quick question to 301, if he's still online?
Is Mr. Hill still with us? Oh, he might have signed off. I think he's on the East Coast, so it's probably closing in on 11:30 out there.
Okay. Well, as usual, outstanding. Thank
you, sir. I am glad. I hope it was worthy of you all's time and energy. I enjoyed the program. Justice, anything to say before we close out?
Thank you, and I enjoyed the program also.
Right on. Again, we will be back on Thursday. Thursday we will have Professor Aurela Gross. This is a recommendation from Dr. Martin Kevorkian. That show is still paying dividends. He recommended two books, Professor Ian Lopez's White by Law. The other book he recommended was Aurela Gross's What Blood Won't Tell. I'm going to have fun this show because her book pretty much revolves around white people having sex with non-white people and the problems that this caused early on in the system of white supremacy when white people would confuse themselves and argue and bicker amongst themselves about if a person was white or if someone in their family had a non-white parent or cousin or aunt or grandfather. She talks a lot about that. She talks about how you had to perform being a white person and what that means, about how whether or not you're a white person a lot of times came down to if you associated with white people or if you associated with non-white people. Very interesting book. The name of it is What Blood Won't Tell, and this is a white woman who wrote this book. She is a professor at the University of Southern California. So that'll be Thursday. It's another late show. If you're on the West Coast, you probably won't care, but that show is 10 p.m. Eastern on Thursday, 7 p.m. Pacific. That'll be Thursday, and then we'll be back on Sunday with Mr. John Patash. His book is The FBI's Attack of Tupac Shakur and Black Leaders. That program will be 7:30 p.m. Eastern, 4:30 p.m. Pacific from Mr. John Patash, white person who did that book. So lots of programs. Hopefully they'll be constructive.
You said Sunday, right?
Yes, Sunday at 4:30 our time, Justice. 4:30 on Sunday.
Oh, 4:30?
Yes, sir. Yes, ma'am. Excuse me.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. And these are all white people. Go ahead, sir.
And one other question to you, Victim. When you go to the White Privilege Conference, will you have any live shows?
Oh, yeah. I plan to act a total fool at the White Privilege Conference. I plan on doing at least 2 shows a day. from the White Privilege Conference. I would like to do one in the evening to kind of wrap up what I saw for that particular day, and I would like to do at least one show in the daytime to try to pull in some of the speakers that they have at the conference. But yes, and yes, emphatically, I hope to do as many shows as possible live from the conference. So yes.
Great, and that starts when?
I believe April 7th, I believe. You can check the website. If you go back and look through the archives and just hit the show that Dr. Moore was on in May, there's a link for the White Privilege Conference. You can click it, and it has all the dates and all that good stuff there. So,
Great.
Yeah.
Great. I will be trying to tune in. Great.
Outstanding. I'm going to prep for Thursday's show, and Justice, I guess, is getting ready to go to bed sometime soon. We will be signing off, victims. We will be back Thursday, 10 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Pacific. Thank you for supporting the effort. Thank you, Non-Mighty Wick, for your assistance, and thank you, Back of the Bus, for your assistance. Check Back of the Bus's website, nonwhitealliance.wordpress.com, and Justice's email. You can hit her up, justice.asap@yahoo.com. Oh, and check the blog. Yeah, I forgot that. Plug everybody with me. The blog, racism-notes.blogspot.com. Thank you for checking out the show. We will be back on Thursday. Peace.
Thank you both.